There are people who live their entire lives with a quiet desire to vanish, not because they hate the world, but because the world has never learned how to hold them gently. They move through life like distant echoes, carrying memories that feel heavier than their own bodies, and emotions they cannot explain to anyone. They are the kind of souls who learned early that silence is safer than confession, retreat is easier than confrontation, and disappearing is sometimes the only way to feel alive. They walk among everyone, yet never truly feel seen by anyone. The psychology behind people who want to disappear is rooted in a strange mixture of exhaustion, emotional overstimulation, and a deep internal conflict between wanting connection and fearing the cost of it. Psychologists often describe this as an internal withdrawal response, a coping mechanism built after years of emotional burden, unmet needs, or a childhood where their feelings were too big for the environment that raised them. These people don't want to die, they just want a temporary escape from the weight of existing in a world that keeps asking them to be stronger than they feel. They are not running away from life, they are running away from the constant pressure to perform, to show up, to stay stable when the ground beneath them is always trembling. They disappear in small ways long before they even think about physically leaving: unanswered messages, avoided calls, fading from social spaces, shrinking from conversations where they once laughed freely. Each time they pull away, they leave behind a version of themselves they no longer have the strength to uphold. For them, disappearing is not an act of abandonment, it is a desperate attempt at self-preservation. Somewhere deep inside, they carry what psychologists call emotional fatigue, a level of inner exhaustion that cannot be fixed by a long sleep or a weekend of rest. It is the result of years spent absorbing too much, expressing too little, and pretending everything is fine even when their soul is tired in ways they cannot articulate. Such people learned early that vulnerability is dangerous. Maybe they were raised in homes where silence was mistaken for strength, where emotions were dismissed as overreaction, or where love felt conditional on how well they behaved. Maybe they were the quiet child who carried the family pressure, or the sensitive one who cried too easily, only to be told to grow up before they ever had the chance to. So over time, they built an inner world, a mental refuge so quiet and private that no one else could enter. Once they discovered the safety of disappearing inward, the outside world became something they endured rather than embraced. They are the kind of people who can sit in a room full of others and still feel like they're fading at the edges. They feel disconnected not because they lack empathy, but because they carry too much of it. Psychologists often see this in those with anxious avoidant emotional patterns, people who desire connection deeply but retreat the moment it starts to feel overwhelming. They disappear because their mind is constantly negotiating two opposing forces: the desire to be understood, and the fear of being misunderstood. It is this paradox that shapes them most. They want someone to notice their silence, but they fear the moment someone asks them why. They hunger for presence, but any form of closeness makes their chest tighten. They want to be missed, but they never want to burden anyone with their absence. So disappearing becomes the middle ground, the only space where they can be invisible without feeling judged, and present without being overwhelmed. For many of them, disappearing isn't physical at first, it's emotional. They stop sharing their thoughts because they assume no one will understand the way they feel. They stop expressing their needs because every unmet need in the past taught them silence hurts less. They stop letting people close because attachment has always left them with a sense of emptiness. And slowly, they become experts at slipping out of moments without anyone noticing. It is not attention they seek, it is relief, relief from noise, relief from expectation, relief from the unspoken pressure to hold themselves together. There is a unique kind of loneliness inside people like this, a loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being unseen. Psychologists call this emotional invisibility, the experience of being physically present but emotionally unrecognized. Once someone grows accustomed to feeling invisible, disappearing doesn't feel like loss, it feels like alignment. Their retreat into solitude becomes a way of reclaiming their emotional center. When they disappear, they finally have space to breathe without explaining themselves. They can exist without performing. They can rest without guilt. But here lies the deeper layer: people who want to disappear are not fragile, they are overwhelmed. They are not weak, they are tired. Disappearing is simply their way of saying, I need silence to hear myself again. Most of the time, they are not trying to escape life, they are trying to return to themselves, and perhaps the most misunderstood truth about them is this: they aren't running from the world, they are searching for a place within it that doesn't drown them. The psychology behind people who want to disappear often begins long before they ever realize it. It begins in childhood, in moments so small that adults brush them aside, but so powerful that they carve themselves into the architecture of a child's emotional world. These people learned early that when they expressed pain, the room grew quiet. When they asked for comfort, no one knew how to hold their trembling hands. When they cried, they were told they were too sensitive, too dramatic, or too emotional, and so they learned to retreat inside themselves, quietly, gradually, permanently. They grew up believing that the safest place to exist was somewhere no one could see. Somewhere their emotions couldn't be misinterpreted, judged, or minimized, and that belief follows them into adulthood like a shadow. Psychologists often see this pattern in individuals shaped by inconsistent emotional environments, homes where love existed, but emotional attunement did not. Where the parents provided shelter but not presence, rules but not warmth, discipline but not understanding, and the child, desperate to make sense of the emotional vacuum around them, concluded that disappearing was easier than being seen incorrectly. This is why, later in life, these people crave invisibility in moments when others crave attention. When they feel overwhelmed, they don't reach outward, they collapse inward. They don't ask for reassurance, they disappear until their heartbeat stops shaking. It is not that they don't trust others, it is that they learn not to trust the reactions of others. They know how it feels to express something fragile and watch someone dismiss it in seconds. They know how it feels to open up and see confusion instead of empathy on the listener's face. They know how it feels to reveal their pain only to be met with impatience or discomfort. So self-protection becomes second nature, not as a choice, but as a reflex. For people like this, disappearing feels like the safest way to exist without risking emotional misattunement. And emotional misattunement is one of the deepest forms of psychological pain, the moment when the world fails to meet them where they are, leaving them stranded inside their own thoughts. Their withdrawal is not a rejection of others, it is a shield against disappointment. Many of these individuals live in constant cognitive dissonance, a psychological tension created by two conflicting internal realities. They want closeness, but closeness terrifies them. They want someone to understand them, but understanding requires vulnerability. They want to matter, but they fear becoming a burden. This emotional contradiction creates a unique kind of suffering, one that psychologists refer to as internal emotional conflict. It is the experience of longing and fear coexisting inside the same heart, pulling them in opposite directions until they feel emotionally paralyzed. So they disappear, not because they don't care, but because they care too deeply. People who want to disappear often carry the weight of unprocessed emotions, years of unspoken fears, unexpressed grief, and unacknowledged wounds. They learn to store emotions instead of releasing them, to endure instead of express, to listen instead of speak. This emotional storage leads to something psychologists call quiet overwhelm, a state where the body appears calm, but the mind is drowning in unspoken noise. They move through life holding back storms no one else can see. When these storms become too loud, disappearing feels like the only way to silence them. They disappear from conversations because their thoughts are too heavy to form into words. They disappear from relationships because they fear disappointing the people they love. Their withdrawal is often misunderstood. People assume they are avoiding responsibilities or isolating themselves out of apathy, but in truth, their disappearance is an act of emotional survival. When the world becomes too loud, they step into the quiet. When expectations become too heavy, they step back. When connection becomes overwhelming, they step away. This stepping away is not avoidance, it is regulation. It is the mind saying, I can't hold everything right now, I need space to breathe. That need for space is not a flaw, it is a symptom of emotional overload built from years of internalizing instead of expressing. Many people who want to disappear also struggle with what psychologists call fragmented self-worth, a sense of identity that was built on meeting expectations rather than exploring their true self. They were the children who were praised for being easy, quiet, low maintenance, or independent, but beneath those labels was a child who never learned how to receive emotional support. So now, as adults, they don't know how to ask for help even when they are breaking, they don't know how to trust comfort even when someone offers it sincerely, they disappear because visibility feels dangerous. And so they build a life where they can exist without fully participating, a life where they can float rather than anchor, a life where they can observe from the sidelines because stepping into the center brings back memories of every moment they felt unwanted, misunderstood, or emotionally alone. But here lies the deepest paradox: these individuals often have some of the most complex emotional worlds, the most intuitive minds, and the most empathetic hearts. They carry too much, they sense too deeply, they observe too closely, they think too far, they love too intensely. And because their emotions are oceans, not puddles, disappearing becomes the only way to prevent drowning. People who want to disappear often live with a quiet contradiction inside them, a contradiction that shapes every decision they make, every relationship they enter, every emotion they suppress, and every moment they withdraw from. They are the kind of souls who have spent years learning how to endure life without ever learning how to inhabit it. This creates a unique internal landscape where emotional self-protection becomes not just a habit, but a way of existing. Their disappearance is rarely sudden. It is a slow fade, like ink dissolving in water, subtle, delicate, almost imperceptible. They shrink from the world gradually, pulling their energy inward piece by piece until the outer world becomes a blur. This fading is guided by a deep psychological instinct, the instinct to protect what little emotional stability they still have. Psychologists often see this in individuals who rely heavily on emotional self-preservation, a coping mechanism shaped by past experiences where expressing emotions led to pain instead of comfort. For these individuals, self-protection becomes their primary emotional language. They shield themselves not only from others, but also from their own internal storms. People like this are experts at retreating before anyone realizes they were hurting. They slip away before their voice trembles, before their eyes reveal too much, before their presence demands an explanation. They withdraw because vulnerability was never a safe space for them, it was a battlefield. They learned early that being honest about their emotions usually meant being misunderstood. Being open meant being judged, being expressive meant being labeled too much, being present meant risking disappointment. So the safest choice became invisibility, not literal, but emotional. They disappear not to avoid life, but to avoid the emotional cost of being seen. For many of them, this instinct is rooted in what psychologists call attachment wounds, not dramatic traumas, but the subtle emotional injuries created when someone needed comfort and received correction instead, when they needed understanding and received silence, when they needed presence and received distance. These wounds teach a child that the world is safer when they hide their needs, and that belief follows them into adulthood like an invisible scar. People who want to disappear often live with hyper-awareness, a psychological pattern where they notice every shift, every silence, every tone, every expression. Their mind is always scanning, always interpreting, always anticipating the moment something will go wrong. This constant vigilance becomes emotionally exhausting. They disappear not from a lack of courage, but from an overload of awareness. Their solitude becomes their sanctuary, not because they dislike people, but because silence is the only place where their nervous system can breathe. In solitude, they don't have to decode meaning, perform stability, or suppress their sensitivity, they can exist without expectation. But here lies the poetic irony: the same solitude that protects them also isolates them. It is this paradox, wanting the world and fearing it at the same time, that defines the psychology of those who disappear. Many of these individuals carry what psychologists call emotional overcapacity, an ability to feel more than the average person, to sense too deeply, to empathize too intensely, but high emotional capacity without proper emotional support often turns into emotional burden. They feel everything, not only their own pain, but also the pain of others. They internalize moods that don't belong to them. They absorb atmospheres like a sponge, they break where others only bend. This emotional overcapacity makes the world feel louder, harsher, heavier, and disappearing becomes their way of lowering the volume. People who want to disappear are often painted as weak, distant, or emotionally closed off, but in reality, they are some of the most introspective, emotionally intelligent souls, people who have spent far too long navigating their inner world without guidance. By the time they reach adulthood, disappearing becomes less of an escape and more of a quiet ritual of survival. But here is the paradox at the heart of their psychology: the same minds that want to disappear also hold the potential to heal, grow, and rise in ways no one expects. Their emotional withdrawal is the first chapter, not the last. Psychologists refer to this turning point as self-realignment, the moment a person begins to question the emotional patterns they've always accepted as truth. They start noticing when they withdraw, they start wondering why certain situations trigger their instinct to escape, they start recognizing the difference between needing space and avoiding pain. This awareness is the first form of emotional empowerment they have ever allowed themselves to experience. They begin to understand that disappearing is not weakness, it is communication, a message from the soul that something within them needs attention, rest, or understanding. Once they start listening to this message, something remarkable happens. They stop disappearing to run away from life and start disappearing to reconnect with themselves. Their solitude transforms, it becomes intentional, not reactive, healing, not hiding. In this new phase, disappearing becomes a form of self-care, a sacred pause from the noise of the world, a moment to breathe without pressure, a space where they can hear the thoughts that get drowned out in daily chaos. Slowly, they begin to rebuild themselves. They start recognizing the emotional wounds they ignored for years, the moments no one comforted them, the needs they suppressed, the vulnerabilities they hid, the storms they endured alone. As they acknowledge these wounds, something profound shifts inside them. They stop blaming themselves for the ways they learned to survive. This is where psychological healing deepens, when a person realizes they are not flawed for wanting to disappear, they were simply never given the tools to stay. They begin to understand that their sensitivity is not a burden, it is a strength, their emotional depth is not a weakness, it is a gift, their silence is not emptiness, it is reflection. As their self-awareness grows, their internal narrative starts to change. They no longer see themselves as someone who disappears, they see themselves as someone who pauses, reflects, recalibrates, and returns with clarity. Psychologists often refer to this stage as identity reintegration, the moment when a person begins reconnecting with the parts of themselves they previously abandoned. They rediscover their voice, their desires, their boundaries, their emotional needs, and this is the most beautiful transformation of all. People who once wanted to disappear begin to want to be present again, not for others, but for themselves. They realize that life does not demand perfection, it only asks for participation. They learn that they don't have to disappear to protect their heart, they just have to listen to it. Slowly, their relationship with themselves becomes softer, kinder, more compassionate. People who once wanted to disappear become people who want to exist, fully, honestly, softly, not loudly, not dramatically, just with quiet authenticity. This is the psychology of people who want to disappear, not a story of vanishing, but a story of returning, a story of rediscovery, a story of learning to hold themselves the way no one ever held them.